welcome both our speaker and our moderator. Heather McGhee, who just spoke with us about her wonderful book, has agreed to step in for the absent moderator, and she designs and promotes solutions to inequality in America. Through her work at Demos with the progressive think tank And Do, she has drafted legislation, testified before Congress, and developed strategies to improve the lives of millions. She currently chairs the board of Color of Change, the nation's largest online racial justice organizations. Heather's garnered over 1 million views of her TED Talk, Racism Has a Cost for Everyone. Her book, The Sum of Us, is beautifully written with startling empathy and clarity, and that is a book that's for sale. And the author we're going to hear from today is Simon Winchester, who's the author of 19 books. Nearly all have been New York Times bestsellers and have ranged from Professor and Madman chronicling the creation of the Oxford English Dictionary to, I'm not going to pronounce it correctly, Krakatoa, The Day the World Exploded, to Pacific, the Atlantic. He carries us through books with a magic blend of science, geography, adventure, human foibles, and humor. In 2006, Winchester was made an officer of the Order of the British Empire, and yet he's here with us today. And he resides in Western Massachusetts. I forgot to announce that everything is being streamed. You can see other things live streaming, but all of the talks throughout this festival will be available on the MV Book Festival's website. So, thank you.
Thank you. Good late morning, everyone. So first of all, at my count, which was how I first began to be intimidated by my own decision to say yes when Sue Ellen asked me to pinch hit for the moderator, by my count, you've actually written 33 books.
Yes, I thought the 17 or whatever it was a little underselling. So.
Which Simon used to explain to me that don't worry if I didn't get all the way through the book in 36 hours, because he can really talk about anything because he's written 33 books. Nonetheless, I did get through the book. It is beautiful, and it's what we want to talk about today.
Great.
It's a real honor to be in this conversation with you.
Thank you, and I think you're so brave stepping in. I mean, George Gibson, who was going to do it, unfortunately his wife fell rather ill, and that you agreed. I'm honored, so thank you.
The festival has been a beautiful experience, and I want to support it. Okay, so you recently, Simon, bought 123.25 acres in Dutchess County, New York. And that was a very powerful experience for you in your first transfer of deed, your first ownership of property, real property. But I want to ask, can anyone really own land?
Well, that's sort of what the book is really all about, because almost every group of indigenous peoples all over the world take the view that individual land ownership is monstrous. No, you certainly can't. You can no more. I mean, the most eloquent speech in that regard is the famous one by Chief Sealth, whose name is used in Seattle today, when he made this very long peroration before selling an enormous amount of land to the settlers, the white settlers in Oregon, Washington State rather, that, well, you're going to give me money for this, and by all means, I'll take your money, but you can no more own this land than you can own the ocean or the breeze. Mm-hmm. And all I pray, as on words of my forefathers and mothers and so forth, is that you look after it, that you tend it properly, because, and this is changing from an American Aboriginal to an Australian Aboriginal, who say the earth is our mother. Mm-hmm. We look after our mother. We don't own our mothers. Mm-hmm. We take care of it. And the book really is an exploration of whether, who does own the land, how people got the land, how it changed the land. Is it right? Is it proper? Is it fair? Is it good? Is it decent? And what we've done with it, and done terrible things and good things, and what we should perhaps do in the future. So it's a very pertinent question. Should we own it? If you go with Proudhon, all property is theft, that effectively is what we're saying about land. Of course you can't own it.
No.
It belongs to us all.
That's right. You can steward it.
Indeed, and a lot of people try to steward it well, but an awful lot of people and a lot of corporations that you were talking about in your earlier address steward it horribly badly.
So let's talk about the things that we need in order to support this fiction of our ownership of land. Boundaries, borders, and frontiers, which you talk about with real beauty in the book.
Well, I'm fascinated by the idea of frontiers anyway. I think my life I've traveled, I was a foreign correspondent for most of my career, and going to places like the Balkans, where in Yugoslavian days, there were no frontiers, and then it became Balkanized in recent years and turned into Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina and Republic Srpska and Croatia. And the creation of borders creates misery, creates refugees. I mean, look at the border, the southern part of the United States and the closed, soon-to-be-opened border to the north of the United States. They cause inherently problems. But where did they begin? And I have to, because I'm, as you may be able to guess, from England originally, my experience in Wiltshire, in southern England, sort of illustrates the point. Consider Bronze Age farmers, let's say 4,000 years ago. They had just learned the basic principles of agriculture, so they are planting seeds and watching them grow and getting the bounty of their labours. They'd grow the seeds in furrows, and so using a very early form of ploughshare called a cashrom, which is basically a fire-hardened stick, but it may ultimately have a bronze or an iron tip to it to make it stronger. He, first of all, makes a hole in which he plants the seeds, and then as he gets more sophisticated, creates a line, a furrow. And then on the land that he's chosen to plant his seeds, another furrow and another. And let's say they all go north-south, approximately, along the bottomlands, the alluvial plain of a river. And his neighbour, slightly, let's say, on a hillside to his right, follows, instead of going north-south, he follows the contour lines, which may go northwest-southeast. So you have two sets of lines. Farmer A going north-south, Farmer B going northwest-southeast. And they come to a point where they intersect, like the ripples on a pond if you throw two stones into it. And where they intersect, back then, and there's evidence for this in Wiltshire and Dorset, where I grew up in England, there are early hedgerows, there are early lines of stones, ha-has, ditches, separating the two pieces of land, because you don't want necessarily, if you're planting different crops from Farmer A to bleed into the land stewarded by Farmer B. So all of a sudden you've got a border, a boundary. And then this idea of separating, delineating one piece of land from another expands to communities. You say this community ends here, let's draw a line of stones or a hedge or ultimately a fence, paling or whatever kind of fence you might put up. And then administrative units, counties, and then countries, and then frontiers, and then national borders. And I think it's probably appropriate to say at this point, although it will take a second, and I hope you don't mind me straying into this, is when borders go completely crazy. And that's the tragic one that and there are many tragedies in the creation of frontiers by human beings, was one I came to know intimately because I lived in India for many years, and that's the border created in 1947, dividing contemporary India and Pakistan. You can imagine the early days of, we the British have decided at long last to give India back, and Mountbatten is installed as the last viceroy, and he's given a very rigid timetable. He says, okay, 15th of August, we're out of there, India, it's all yours. And the Indians, not unreasonably, started disputing among themselves whether they should be one country, which is what the Mahatma, Mr. Gandhi, wanted, or whether, as Muhammad Ali Jinnah wanted, there should be two countries. There should be India, a secular country, with two Muslim-dominated countries, one in the west, one in the east, called then West Pakistan and East Pakistan. East Pakistan, of course, is now Bangladesh. So, all right, said a frustrated Mountbatten, you can do that, but how are we going to create the borders? And so he rang up in London an old friend of his called Sir Cyril Ratcliffe, a Welsh lawyer of powerful rectitude and standing, much respected in the British civil service, but he had never been to India. In fact, he had never been east of Paris. But will you come and draw a border between these two entities? And leaving, he did East Pakistan as well, but that's drawing a line through Bengal. The famous or the infamous one is the line through the Punjab, which is the most agricultural rich part of northwest India. So he had to draw a line. He was given a house up in the hills in Simla and a series of maps, most of which were out of date, and 6 assistants who loathed each other and were constantly bickering. And he immediately, as many people in India, Westerners coming to India, he got the trots, if I can put it that way. He was somewhat unwell. And, but nonetheless, he had 3 weeks to draw a border between these new entities, Pakistan, of course, being an acronym for Punjab, Afghan, Kashmir, Istan. And so he drew a line. He looked at out-of-date demographic data. He looked at the contours and said, well, this village we'll put, that village will go to India, and that one will go to Pakistan. And after his 3 weeks, 1,700-mile line was drawn. And he gave the maps to Mountbatten. Independence was declared, Freedom at Midnight, the famous book, India's tryst with destiny. And then the borders were announced publicly. And what happened, as you'll probably all know, is that all the Muslims that were living in India, this new entity called India, fled into Pakistan, which they figured would be safe because it was a Muslim country. And the Hindus who lived in now a Muslim-dominated country were scared and ran eastwards, joining with them with the Sikhs, who were another group moving into India. And the two sets of people set about killing each other in huge numbers. 2 million people died in the transfer of population. I mean, it was a bungle of epic proportions. And the fault of it lay, obviously, in the policy set down by Mountbatten. One might argue to this day that Jinnah had a lot to do with it, on insisting on the creation of Pakistan. But the man who actually created the border, Sir Cyril Ratcliffe, was broken by it. This bloody line, he called it. And he burned all his notes, refused to accept the modest fee for this cartography, a skill that he was completely unschooled in, and returned to England a shriveled and terribly, terribly unhappy man. And there's a short movie, which I make a reference to in the book, made by a very sympathetic Indian filmmaker, about the moment when, some 20 years later or so, what he had done was memorialized by a poem written by W.H. Auden. And his wife turned on the radio, and there was this poem about this tragic figure caught up in the greatest mistake in the British Empire, listening to himself and listening in a beautiful, a lyrical piece of poetry about the terrible error that had been made and the number of people that died, and that he died very shortly afterwards. But that's an example of the lunacy of drawing borders where there should be no borders. And as a final point, and I don't want to usurp all your time here, is if you go to YouTube...
Your time.
Well, our time, please. If you go to YouTube and look up, there's only one border crossing between India and Pakistan at a place called Wagah, W-A-G-A-H. And every night at 6 o'clock, there's the closing of the border ceremony. And the Pakistani rangers, all 6'3" tall men with great sort of uniforms with cockades on their hats, and on the other side, the Indian Border Security Force, equally tall men marching up to each other in looking like the Ministry of Silly Walks, John Cleese, looking like the New York Rockettes, except they're huge male soldiers marching towards each other, looking menacing until just at 6 o'clock, they are moustache to moustache. Their toes shined to a brilliance unattainable by all human beings. Toes over the white line, Radcliffe's line between them. They shake hands briefly and then slam the doors shut, and the border is closed for another night. Go to it, you'll be amazed. This is the lunacy behind the making of borders. So I'm sorry I went on a bit,
No,
but
it's beautiful, it's beautiful, it's beautiful. So that raises the question then, we have all of this contest over land, so much life lost, so much biodiversity lost, in order to conquer, own, divide land. And yet you talk in the book about this question, is there a place where there is land that has never been owned by anyone?
Well,
what does it have to teach us?
That's a lovely question because, yes, I mean, once you accept that we Westerners largely are going to own land, whether we should or not, we find that in the chain of land ownership, we're always taking it from someone else. Right. Either we're fighting over it or we're giving huge sums of money for it or whatever. But I was interested to learn whether there was a place which, as you say, had never been owned by anyone, and there was no grief in the acquisition of this land. And there is such a place, and it's a very big place with a name possibly unfamiliar to many of you. It was to me. It sounds like out of a science fiction novel. It's called Flevoland, Flevoland, and it's in Holland. And what had happened was, Holland, the Netherlands, the low lands, the big enemy is today, and of course increasingly with climate change will be tomorrow, is the sea. The country is perpetually at risk of being inundated. And so this extraordinary man called Joseph Lely decided that the huge body of water inside the Netherlands, called the Zuider Zee, would be dammed off. There would be a 25 or so mile long dam built to prevent the North Sea coming into the centre of Holland and inundating it, which happened all the time. So the project took about 25 years, and then finally the Zuider Zee no longer was a sea, it was a fresh, or potentially freshwater body of water called the IJsselmeer. So now, to an extent, Holland is protected from the ravages of the sea, although as the North Sea gets higher and higher, it licks ever more hungrily at this dam. But inside, the Dutch then thought, well, what shall we do? We're a big, powerful trading nation. We've got a growing population. We've got lots of industry and all the rest of it. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague are pretty crowded cities. Let's create some more land in the IJsselmeer. So they, if I can put it crudely, fenced off 1 million acres, which is a fairly large chunk of land, or chunk of sea. And they built dams all around it in the very southern part of the IJsselmeer, and then had 6 gigantic pumps, the like of which you'll have never seen in your lives, working night and day for 10 years to pump the water out of this 1 million acre oblong. And slowly, slowly, the water inside lowered and lowered and lowered until, in the late 1950s, mud appeared. It was squishy, horrible, brown, awful mud. And you couldn't possibly walk on it, you'd sink, and it would be disastrous. So they would then fly aircraft over it, seeding it with reeds. And every time the reeds grew, which they did because it was relatively fertile soil, they would set fire to them using napalm, oddly enough, an invention made here in Massachusetts, which we can talk about later, perhaps. And
33 bucks, people. 33 bucks. That's everything. It's a little bit about everything.
And so you've got ash, put in some more reeds, more flame, more ash, and then after about 5 more years of doing this, hardy grasses. You'd once again seed from aeroplanes. And the result of all of this was that by the early 1980s, you had substantial soil, 1 million acres of soil on which you could now walk. You could, you could have footpaths, you could lay conduits for power, you could bring in road rollers, you could bring in excavators, you could plan a community. And so they did, and made, this is going to be a town called Lelystad in honor of Joseph Lely, who had started the whole ball rolling. And they had about 500,000 of those acres laid to agriculture. They said, this is where there's going to be agriculture. And we are going to, it was all done in hectares, but let's use acres for, this is America. And so let's say 60-acre plots. And we, the government, the royal family, of course, technically owns it. But we're going to allow people to rent it for a peppercorn rent, a trivial rent, for 10 years. And if you improve it in a Jeffersonian way, then, or Lockean way, then you can own it. So they put advertisements in the big papers in Rotterdam and Amsterdam saying land for rent. Anyone that wants to be a farmer and thinks they can, you can get it for more or less nothing. Just come and populate this. But shrewdly, the Dutch, wishing to preserve the sort of demographic makeup of the country as a whole, said 30% of the applicants that'll be successful will be Catholic, 30% Protestant, 30% members of the Dutch Reformed Church, 10% other. And lo and behold, it worked after a fashion. Now, Flevoland, agriculturally very successful, with Lelystad, probably the most boring city in the world. Railway service, airport, all the services you expect, is now the 12th province of the Netherlands, of which Holland is one. So this is a great experiment, and no lives were lost, no blood was shed in the making of this piece of land. So you might say, you know, same thing happened in Hong Kong, where I used to live, and in New York City with the creation of landfill. But this is done on a heroic scale, and it more or less works. And it's all part of, and just one final thing, what's called the Polder Principle. All these dry pieces of Dutch land are known as polders because they're drained from the sea, and they're potentially threatened by the sea. But in protecting them, all Dutch people pull together, whether they are Catholic or Protestant, black or white, to the right or to the left, because the polders, the sea is the common enemy. So they give up their petty internal squabbles to say the integrity of the land is the most important thing.
So from a place where the transfer of ownership was bloodless, caused no grief, I want to ask about the biggest landowners in the world. Who are they, and are they virtuous, villainous? How should we think about them?
Well, if you go back to the original thought that no one should own land, then they're all theoretically villainous. And the most villainous of them all, I suppose, is, I put my hand on my heart, Queen Elizabeth II, because she remains the biggest individual landowner in the world. I mean, it is easily forgotten that she owns all of England, in theory. And before, should we explain something that may sound at first ludicrous? In many, many countries that have emperors or hereditary rulers, queens, kings, whatever, there is the belief that all land belongs to God, and that as these creatures, whether they're emperors or kings or queens, are the earthly representatives of God, so the land ultimately, in human terms, belongs to that monarch. And the Queen owns all the land in England, Australia, New Zealand, the Commonwealth, the white Commonwealth, has to be said. If I were to own land, I don't in England, my parents, now dead, did, they buy it in what is known as fee simple, which is they have the absolute right of ownership, but deep, deep down, the ultimate title belongs to the Queen. Very, very rarely does the Queen or people acting on her name exercise that power, except, of course, in the case of things like eminent domain. Because, I mean, going back to this idea of, let's say, my 123 acres or any land that any of you may own, if you don't pay your taxes, then that land ultimately will be taken away from you. So does that mean who owns it? Is it the state of Massachusetts? Is it, in my case, Dutchess County, New York? Is it the United States of America? Is it for the old colonies, the Queen? It's a complicated story, and fascinating. But who, among the private landowners in the world today, the biggest, leaving aside monarchs, is an Australian woman called Gina Reinhardt, who owns, I think, 37 million acres, which is about the size of England. Most of her land is in Western Australia, and she's a mining baroness, and so most of it is for extractive purposes, coal, iron, that sort of thing. In the United States, the biggest landowners are both television titans, Ted Turner and John Malone, and they sort of have bragging rights for the 2 million acres that they each own. Ted Turner mostly in the West, Malone West, but also a lot of Maine, for instance, belongs to him. And he's hoping, and the environmental people in Maine wish him to, if he's going to log it sustainably. And generally speaking, he's more interested in horses and his land in Ireland. But nonetheless, there is hesitancy. Turner, I think, is generally regarded as a fairly good steward of his land, not least because he seems to be reversing one of the savage things that happened in the 19th century, which was the wholesale slaughter of the buffalo, the bison, which people used to come on train journeys just to shoot them, with the Native Americans for whom all this land, of course, had been stolen, and that's what we've really not talked about.
Yeah.
And then they, generally speaking, are pretty decent, but the fellows that I think are not decent are a couple called the Wilkes brothers. I don't know if you managed to get to them in the book. The Wilkes brothers, they're a couple from far west Texas. I have to be politically careful here, but they are, let us say, ardent supporters of the former president of the United States. They don't believe in climate change and a lot of things that most rational people do believe in. They ran a fracking company, which sort of ticks a number of boxes, of course. And they were then bought out in about 10 years ago by the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund for $4.5 billion. So each of these two young men had $2 billion to spend. And they decided to go on a spending spree on land and bought up vast tracts in Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, from which they excluded people. Suddenly they put up barriers and security cameras and armed guards and so forth, and have taken it off the register. And the Westerners particularly said, there's an informal agreement that, yes, you may own the land, but we're allowed to use it, to walk on it or fish on it or whatever. They say no. And to me, that's dog in a manger behavior, which is, it shouldn't be allowed.
So throughout the book, let's go back to this because you began here, but let's go back because you tell so many stories throughout the book of Aboriginal land and of white confiscation of that land. How did you think about it? What are some of the most important stories that you wanted to tell?
Well, as I live in this country now, I wanted to know something about the confiscation of lands from Native Americans. I mean, I'm not entirely certain about the Wampanoag here in Martha's Vineyard, but where we live, and indeed the land that I have in Dutchess County, was populated by Mohicans, who are now largely in Wisconsin. And why? Why are they not on the land, living co-equally with me? Why are they shoved out? Well, the shoving out of the Mohican is trivial compared to the forcible marches of what we call the 5 civilized tribes. And of course, the footnote is that they're civilized, but regarded as, quote, civilized by us whites because they kept slaves. Which seems to be monstrous sort of misuse of language. And they, the Cherokee and the various other from the American Southeast, were forcibly moved westward to what is now Oklahoma. And there they live, and they were further moved to various reservations. And indeed, I remember the first story I did for The Guardian when I moved here in 1972 as a reporter was to cover the business in Wounded Knee, South Dakota, on the reservation there, when there was a understandable uprising between the American Indian movement and the federal government, and they brought in tanks. I mean, to stand with a tank full of soldiers on the South Dakota plains with Indians saying, "But this is our land. I mean, for God's sake, why are you here? Just bugger off," you know. And indeed, I mean, let me just say parenthetically, we live in the Berkshires now, and very close to us is Hotchkiss School, very fancy private school where the elite of the United States, many of them have been educated. The Hotchkiss people, I mean, the fortune of the Hotchkisses came from the manufacture of the Hotchkiss machine gun, which was used first in action in either 99 or 89, against the Sioux in the Battle of Wounded Knee, where they were just machine gunned to death. Yeah. And yet the school, when I gave a speech there, no one in the school knew. Yeah. And I said, this is monstrous. They should be, at least on the anniversary of the massacre, the kids should wear a black armband or something, and there should be a scholarship, surely, for a Sioux child to come and be a student there. But anyway, moving right along, the event that fascinated me particularly, because I used to live in Oklahoma when I was a youngster, was the Oklahoma Land Run of April 1889, where the part of Oklahoma, it wasn't called Oklahoma at the time, but the part that had not been settled by displaced Indians and was therefore called the Unassigned Lands, which was a T-shaped, about 2 million acres. Someone thought, well, let anyone that wants it have it. And so in the northern edge of it, thousands of people gathered on their horses or in the Conestoga wagons or on foot, and that's on the Kansas side, and on the eastern side, the Arkansas side, they did the same thing. And on this day, I think it was the 22nd of April, 1889, US cavalry officers at noon blew their trumpets or waved flags, and these people rode like the devil into the unassigned lands, and when they got somewhere that they thought looked agreeable, leapt off their horses or out of their wagons, planted their claim flags and said, "This is mine," and went to the nearest. There was one tent, which was the US Government Land Claims Office, paid a $5 registration fee, and their land, 160 acres, quarter section, 640 acres for a full section, and they began to populate it. And the place that fascinated me was at the town. There was a railway line from Galveston to Chicago, which had a watering stop, no people, but a place where the engines stopped to get water, at a place called Guthrie. And so a lot of people thought the landscape here, there was the Cimarron River, and there was nice sort of prairie countryside. A lot of people planted their flags there, so many that a town instantly rose up. It's the fastest growing town in American history. At 6 a.m. on the morning of the 22nd of April, 1899, Guthrie had a population of 0. 6 p.m., it had a population of 15,000. They had the first north-south road the next morning. They had an east-west road, that was Boundary Street, Division Street the next day. They had asphalt paving brought in a week, the electricity line, telegraph line. And it was no longer tents. The brick buildings were up within 6 weeks or so. And then there was it was the capital of this new state called Oklahoma. And it became so for a few months until Oklahoma City, about 30 miles to the south, wrested the crown. And the man who had designed Guthrie, who was a Canadian, oddly enough, went off further west, and he and his wife bought another plot of land near Los Angeles, and they gave it the name that it still has today, which is Hollywood.
So we are going to take some questions, but first I want to ask you, as my potentially final question to you, to look to the future. You've contended in this book with the sordid history and the sort of unifying hunger that has shaped our history of land ownership, and yet with the waters rising, with our populations growing, with a rising consciousness about the sort of original sin of most land acquisition, what do you see as the future?
Well, oddly enough, in where we live in Western Massachusetts now, there is a growing movement, and this is not an exclusively New England phenomenon, but a growing movement away from private ownership and community land ownership, replacing it. And I must say I'm entirely in favour of that. The 123 acres are now being given to the Dutchess County Land Conservancy. The land that we have, a smaller plot where we live in Berkshire County, that will ultimately be destined for no further development, but just, I mean, we've not talked about trespass at all, but anyone can use it. I mean, it should be absolutely open to all. And I think the idea of the acquisition of land, private land, should be discouraged. I know this is a difficult thing to talk about here in Martha's Vineyard, but I find it, if I can say so, surprising. I won't say outrageous, but surprising that the seashore is largely private, which alien to every way, I think, certainly coming from England. And in Scandinavia, there is, for instance, this principle called allemansrätten, which is that all land, no matter who owns it, is open to all, as long as you behave yourself. There is a sort of code of conduct. You can't dig huge holes or set off weapons or, build gigantic fires. But you can camp and you can walk and you can sleep on the land, no matter who it belongs to. And that, of course, includes the seashore. Right. In America, if you tried to do that, particularly in Texas, you'd have your head blown off.
Yeah. Can you talk just a little bit about that decision you made?
The decision
with Dutchess County, about your own land.
Yes, I mean, it's a bit, I don't want to be mealy-mouthed about this because we're thinking of building a book barn on our property, to essentially a library, but a public library, on our land. And to finance that, we have thought about selling this chunk of land in Dutchess County. But we've been sort of rethinking it and wondering what to do with it. And one of the many options is the Dutchess County Land Conservancy said, well, give us a conservation easement. You know, we'll look after it. You can keep a little bit of it to build a house on if you like, and we'll take over the rest of it. You'll still have to pay the taxes on it, which seems somewhat fair, but it'll never be developed. And that I like, the idea. Because when I initially bought the land, initially I didn't think very much of it. I had just arrived here from Hong Kong, and I was happy to have a little house and a little tract of land, or quite a decent tract of land. But it was pretty useless land. But then I became an American citizen in 2011, and then the idea of actually owning a piece of America seemed to me to be symbolically very interesting. So I started looking into the histories of who I bought it from and who he bought it from. And you see the chain of title going backwards, initially printed, then crudely typewritten, and then handwritten. And then you go back and back and back, and it ceases to be in English. The transfers are in Dutch, because Henry Hudson was working for the Dutch when he came up to the river in that part of the world. And the transfers were made, they weren't sales, they were agreements made with the Mohicans, who didn't sign it, but drew little creatures, little rabbits and deer and things. And then that was the realization that they didn't own the land, and that they thought what these Dutchmen were doing and saying, let me give you 30 pieces of silver and I'll take your land. They didn't get it until nowadays. Right. They get it, and sitting up there in Wisconsin, they say, quite reasonably in my view, that was an outrage.
Yeah. All right, questions? Please come to the microphones and ask your question.
Okay, Simon, I have a question about Brexit and Ireland.
Right. Thank you for that. Yes. So, wait a minute, that was the question?
That was the question.
And you're wiping down the microphone after that? Well, what can I say? I am profoundly opposed to Brexit. I lived in Ireland. I was the Northern Ireland correspondent of the paper for The Guardian for 3 years. The lunacy of that border between Northern Ireland and the South staggers me still. And it's a classic example of you create a border, you create a problem. And whether that's an informal border like that between northern and southern Sri Lanka, the borders created in the West Bank, in Palestine, the one I've mentioned in India and Pakistan. I mean, you can't believe the complexity of the border in Bangladesh, for instance, where you have so many squiggles and turns that there are these things called exclaves, which are parts of India inside Bangladesh, and inside the exclaves, another part of Bangladesh, and inside that, another part of India. So a person living in a hut in what he believes to be Bangladesh has to go into India, go into Bangladesh, go into India, go into Bangladesh. Each time illegally, because he's supposed to have a passport to do so. I mean, it is insanity. And, well, as I say, I'm obsessed, fascinated by borders, but the architects of Brexit, there's this place in hell reserved for them, in my view.
Why?
Well, because I believe that okay, and let me address this point. The Queen gave me this thing. I'm surprised you didn't bring it up first of all, actually. She gave me a gong in whatever it was, 2006. And jolly nice too, the Order of the British Empire.
Yes.
Empire. I mean, you must
Yes,
cringe
yes,
at
yes,
the...
yes,
and
yes, I did.
There is a move to change the name of this award. There's the MBE, the OBE, the CBE. I mean, in the great sort of list of acronyms in the British honours systems, the best, of course, are the really senior ones for diplomats. What is it? CMG, KCMG, and GCMB, the Order of St. Michael and St. George. CMG, it is said, stands for Call Me God. KCMG is Kindly Call Me God. GCMG is God Calls Me God. Well, an OBE, which derisively my friends say means other buggers' efforts, is an award I'm proud to have, but I cringe today under its name. And so they are thinking, but the Buckingham Palace moves in slow and mysterious ways, changing it to the Order of British Excellence. And that I'm relatively happy with. We are a very diminished people now. We need the comfort and solidarity of our Europe. We are Europe, for heaven's sake. There may be 21 miles of ocean between us and the French, but we're the same people. I wince to say that, but we are. And I think we should be grown up about it and throw in our lot with Denmark and Hungary and Norway and all the rest of them. We're no longer a Little Englanders.
Yeah.
And I say that with, I mean, I grew up and we ran a quarter of the world. Now we run nothing at all. We can't even run a railway system.
Thank you. Next question.
You remind me of the famous headline, Fog in Channel, Continent cut off.
Exactly.
Forgive me if I arrived a little bit late, but what we were just talking about is, to me, in the category of fiddling while Rome and everybody else drowns.
Yeah.
What do you see as is there a possibility of this inundation not taking millions of lives while tens of thousands of people are rich enough to escape it?
It's a wonderful question. It sort of underpins almost all the talks at this festival. I mean, most notably, of course, Betsy Colbert yesterday and today. It's a very depressing scenario, and we've, I mean, the east coast of the United States has lost a trivial amount in recent years to sea level rise, 13,000 acres, which is nothing. But on the other hand, events like the Sea Cliff, or whatever it was called, disaster in Florida the other day, are indications that the sea is nibbling, it's gnawing away at the vitals of this country and most other coastal countries in the world. And indeed, nowadays, many of the low-lying Pacific islands are declaring emergencies. Vanuatu, Kiribati, the only country in the world which extends both over the dateline and the equator. So it's yesterday, today, tomorrow, and summer and winter all at the same time. That is drowning so fast that the New Zealand government is now offering climate change refugee status to people that say from Kiribati, we're giving up and can we come and I should say, because I'm an optimist as far as land is concerned, that the country to look at where reform is gathering momentum in giving land back to its rightful owners. And I think we all agree that the rightful owners of this country, we're white settlers. I mean, I don't have to tell you about the white settler countries. We are guests. They are the owners. Well, in New Zealand, that is now national policy. And slowly, but I mean, the legal implications are profound. Maori are getting title back, which is a very good thing in my view.
That's right. Right. The book begins with a caveat in a beautiful, fine rectangle, basically saying what your question was. With the world's sea level rising fast, the assumption that land is the only thing that can't fly away or the only thing that lasts is for the first time now shown to be demonstrably false. So there is that caveat hung over the whole thing.
I have a question about recognition, and specifically building on this, the wonderful display of recognition in the border between India and Pakistan, and then the question of non-recognition, mutual non-recognition perhaps, and another Indian border, the one that faces, at least when I traveled the border, it used to say Tibet. And of course China doesn't see it that way. So I'm just wondering, using these two sort of Indian borders, if you could speak to the question of what importance you'd give to sort of even incredibly hostile recognition, as is the case with Pakistan and India, but it still sort of exists as we see that on display.
When you're talking about recognition, you mean recognition by the international community, or
The parties. Or
the parties involved? Yes.
It would be incredibly difficult for me to imagine something similar going on between China and India, where they would actually stop and stare at each other. And I've been there, that mustache to mustache. So, I mean, I'm just wondering about, what's going on there, and if you have any sort of reaction to that.
Once again, it goes back to my obsession. When I first went to India, I actually drove there from London or Oxford, where I was living at the time, drove to Delhi with my then 12-year-old son. And all sorts of adventures, which I won't bore you with, but I mean, in those days it was possible to drive through Afghanistan with, it was a wonderful place to go on holiday, and we used to cross the Khyber Pass and go back into Pakistan. And you'd shuttle between Delhi, Amritsar, Lahore, Peshawar, places that are impossible to visit now, and then you'd go to Jacobabad and to Kabul for a holiday. You go camping. Not anymore. But these borders you get to, let's say, the Khyber Pass, and because of centuries and that border has existed notionally, and it is a sort of a geographical division line which has been formalized by treaty, the people are suddenly very different. I mean, you are talking to people that speak Punjabi, if you like, on this side of the line, and you go 5 miles over the other, and they can't understand each other and the sentries, they are Afghan sentries and Pakistani sentries. I remember when we arrived, I was driving a Volvo, and it was a Volvo I'd bought in America, so it was left-hand drive, but we had been driving on the right-hand side of the road ever since we reached France, so through France, Germany, all the rest of it. And then Afghanistan drives on the right, but then you come to the red and white pole and the Pakistan flag, and there was a soldier who looked very, very different from all the Afghan soldiers I'd seen up to that point. This is going to your point about recognition. And he recognized himself as very, very different from the Afghans. And he was dressed in what looked like British Army uniform. And he recognized my number plate, lifted the red and white pole, saluted smartly, and said, "Sir, welcome to former British India. You must now be driving on the left, and will you stop and please kindly have a cup of tea?"
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have left.
Oh,
it's really terrible, particularly because my Pakistani American husband really wants to ask a question. I was trying to give him a signal that the timekeeper. All right, he's allowed to ask a question.
Well, then
says
there's
the
my wife
timekeeper.
over there. She-
Oh, and your wife.
Yeah.
Oh, the spouses want
Yes,
to ask
please.
questions.
Both of them must ask a question.
All right, we'll take both at once.
Setsi, you first.
yes,
Sorry,
please.
Kasim. Just,
On most of these panels, it's been a black and white story. And I see a black person and a white person. A lot of the 20th century was about war with the Asian peoples.
Totally,
Yeah. And we're in between an anniversary between the dropping of 2 atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And yet I've heard nothing about it. And if you look at the 20th century, it's been a war against Japan, napalm, and actually it was the napalm bombing of Japan. They bombed 67 cities. And napalm was invented on February 14th, Valentine's Day, 1942, at Harvard. And it was used to decimate most of Japan. And then after most of the people were starving, then they decided to drop 2 atom bombs. So, and then they went to Korea, and Korea was actually napalmed also. And the belief is that only Vietnam was napalm, but it's not true. It's been used a lot. And napalm has been used in Syria. It's been used in other places. So,
you're
what
absolutely
I'm
right.
saying
And can I,
is
let me...
Asia is missing from the conversation, and we take a big percentage of the world. And if you want to leave us out of the conversation, that's okay. But the last time it happened in 1942, as a Japanese person, if you had 1/16 Japanese blood, even though I was born in the United States, and I'm the American, he's the immigrant,
Yeah.
and yet everybody calls us the immigrant, I would have been put into a U.S. concentration camp. And so when, we need to all talk together. It can't just be white, black, men, women. We are all responsible for this earth. And if we're talking about all the forests that were destroyed, napalm destroyed like all these jungles in Vietnam that were, eating up the greenhouse gases or whatever, So when do we, as Americans, look at the responsibilities we have to the whole world, and, start including people like me in the conversation.
Thank you.
I've been excluded by, a lot of,
Well done,
I was
sweetie.
a journalist.
Do you want to stack my question on?
Yes,
It's very,
please.
and it actually, I think, goes very nicely with that. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how we could change the narrative around the tragedy of the commons, which, even Garrett Hardin himself tried to revise, though no one listened, and it still continues to sort of be orthodoxy for people who think that private property actually is necessary for safeguarding and stewardship and the building of wealth. And I think there is a way to tie those 2 threads together in terms of thinking about solidarity and solidaristic forms of community ownership.
Yes, well, the tragedy of the commons is, of course, underlies the argument that, as you say, private property is the only thing. And I think what we've done to our land is a demonstration of how bad a system private property really is. I leave you with one image. Most big American cities have beltways around them, 495 being, and 395 will be familiar to you guys living in Boston, 495 those who are living in Washington. But there's one city that has a beltway which doesn't go all the way around. It goes only 3/4 of the way around, and there is a slice taken out of it, and that is Denver. Denver, there is no beltway. And the reason is because that triangle in the northwest over which no expressway runs was where the Rocky Flats plutonium pit factory was built, creating weapons, the like of which we used in Hiroshima, not Nagasaki, that was a different kind of bomb, but plutonium-based bombs. 5,500 plutonium-based warheads in the world today. The pollution left behind by this factory, which now no longer exists, has permanently disfigured the landscape and caused, trivially, inconvenience to motorists traveling around Denver. But it is a vivid reminder that the tragedy is the tragedy of private ownership, not the tragedy of the commons, and we've got to come up to some ideal of common ownership, common belief the land is our mother. We don't own the land. She looks after us, we look after her.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Simon. Thank you for your help.
Thank you so much, Simon Winchester, and thank you so much to Heather McGhee for stepping in for this fascinating conversation.